Hello. Sawmills, along with the railroad logging, greatly sped up the production of lumber, the cutting of logs in the forest, and turning those logs into finished lumber that could be used for construction purposes wherever wood was needed for construction, pine, hardwood, any lumber like that. And a lot of this new technology developed during the time period of logging in the Great Lakes region. So today we're going to talk about the evolution of sawmills on this week's episode of North Country History with Rob Berg. So settle in, sit back, and enjoy the show. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. Hello, this is Rob, and you're listening to North Country History with Rob Berg. Last week's episode, we talked about railroad logging and how the development of railroads, mainly for the movement of logs from the forest to the sawmill, greatly increased the production of lumber in Michigan and the Great Lakes region in the 19th century, mainly from the late 1870s onward, although, as you heard in that episode, some of the usage began as early as the 1850s. But to go along with the use of the railroads, the sawmills were very important in the greater production of lumber as well. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the evolution of sawmills and how that changed from the earliest sawmills here in what became the United States in Maine in the 1630s, as we talked about in the episode on logging in the Northeast, Part 1, Maine, the evolution of the birth of the lumber industry. Sorry, I forgot the name of that title. But with that, the earliest water-powered sawmills, starting as early as settlement along the New England coast. So we're going to jump up about 200 years to the lumbering industry really taking off in the Great Lakes region. Water-powered sawmills were the thing that was being used for 200 plus years here in the British colonies of North America, in the French colonies in Canada, New France, as it was known as, and then up until the 1840s really was when a new technology took off, and that would be the steam-powered sawmill, changing from water power. But jump back just a little bit. That water-powered sawmill was not the first way for cutting logs. That early form of doing that would have been using a hand saw. We see crosscut saws today, the two-man saws, not used for logging purposes for the most part, though you're going to see some operations where they're going to do that. Amish communities where they choose not to use more advanced technology. You're going to still use crosscut, or they may still use crosscut saws. And in some cases, those saws are still quite efficient. I've used them. They're fine for a short while. But give me a chainsaw to be used for all day of cutting of logs of timber. But with the crosscut saws, cutting the trees down, that's one thing. But cutting them into boards, well, it wasn't quite the crosscut saw that was being used. It was one called a rip saw. And rip saws are just part of the evolution of a handsaw that dates back, would you believe, all the way back to the Neolithic age, the late Stone Age. So we're talking, more than 10,000 years ago that's going to happen. Somebody may call me on the exact length of time for that. I I'm only guessing here. I'm making an educated guess because 10,000 years ago was about when the last ice age came through in North America, but it probably actually predates that period and not necessarily North America. It was across the globe at the time. But they go back prior to the discovery of metals. So saws were used as a cutting tool of one form or another, probably mostly made out of bone or antler. And then they slowly developed into the saws that we know today. A crosscut saw has been known to have been used in Roman times, but they did not become popular usage until the 1400s. So we're still looking at, quite a long period of time that saws have been around for cutting of lumber. But the rip saw, ripping the logs into boards, that was certainly something that was being used for quite a long period of time. And prior to that, you would have had to use an axe to split the logs. And that is still done to this day, again, in certain areas, certain communities across the world, but certainly not nearly as efficient as using a saw. And by the 1630s here in North America, those saws were being replaced by a mechanical saw that was powered by water. Using the flow of water in streams and rivers, pushing a wheel, that could cause the movement of a saw up above in the sawmill located right up above that waterway. And these earliest saws were basically just a single blade of a saw, basically the rip saw, the pit saw, moved inside, and that was then attached to a framework. And the saw only cut on the downward pole, just like it would have been in the pit saw. And so you're only cutting one length at a time going down, and then you got to bring it back up, and then it'll go down again. And so you could see these saws were quite slow. However, they were faster than men hand sawing in a pit. Plus, you have to remember, one man is in that pit below the log. What direction does sawdust go when it's being pulled down on the cut? Yes, of course, it's going down into the face of that man in the pit. So it was not a comfortable place. And sometimes they put the log on a scaffold. So instead of being in a pit, you were still underneath the log, but you were more in the open. Either way, uncomfortable for sawing, and it was time-consuming. It was difficult. It was hot work. Even in the wintertime, you'd work up a sweat. You stop. The cold air hits you. You freeze. So it was very uncomfortable work. A water-powered sawmill, as slow as it is compared to modern standards, was certainly an improvement. But you're still cutting that slowly. You're cutting it one log at a time, and because of the heavy frame that saw would be in, it could cause that it would, like I said, it would be slow, but it could also shake that saw blade, and it's going back and forth, and then that kerf, which is what you call the width of that cut, it could be fairly wide, and you have lossage of lumber in that process. The muley saw was a saw that was developed sometime around the 1700s, I believe. And that saw would have been a little bit faster to cut because it's still in a framework. And that frame is important because it helps guide the cut of the saw, so you're cutting in a straight line. But the muley saw, the frame was lighter, and it could go a bit faster. And as you go faster, you're not going to have that saw blade shake as much. And so you could actually you could go down through a little bit narrower of a curve. And that was fine. Here in North America, it continued to be used, and you could add multiple blades to that saw. and you could have then what's called a gang saw, and you could cut in a large log. You could cut number of cuts through there at a time, and that would be working great for if you wanted to get several boards out of that log. And of course, that would also be with the gang saw. They're evenly placed apart, so you're going to have even cuts in there, and you'll have uniform widths of your boards that way. So all of this is an improvement over those initial single blade up and down saws, or the saws that were used prior to the muley saw and prior to the gang saw. Technology for the driving of that saw changed along the way. Steam engines were invented in the very late 1600s, early 1700s in England by a man named James Watt. And you can actually see one of Watt's early steam engines at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Henry Ford was a great collector of everything, and steam engines was one of his particular interests. And there are a few early English steam engines that are on exhibit at the Henry Ford Museum. As many of you know through the podcast, it was one of my first museum jobs, working at the Henry Ford Museum in the 1990s. So the usage of steam power developing into powering the sawmills made for faster and more efficient technology and or cutting of the lumber. And that coincided with the change in the blade, or in the type of saw that was used. Previous was the up and down saws, basically one long saw blade, probably about 8 to 10 feet long, and those would have to be filed or sharpened frequently. How you sharpened a saw is you took a file and you sharpened each individual tooth, and that would take a long time. So you wanted to find something that would work a little bit faster. In the 1770s, circular saws were invented in England, and they were pretty much just used there in Europe until about 40 years later, around 1814, is when the circular saw was introduced to usage in the United States. And it slowly took off from there. By the 1840s, it became in general use throughout the United States, and particularly here in the Great Lakes region. You started to see circular saws as the main saw that was used. And why was the circular saw more popular? Well, if you look at it, you see a saw blade in your mind of a sawmill, and it's the big circular one with teeth on there, and it's spinning fast, and it's continuously cutting through that saw. So you're only cutting on the downward. That's the one thing that is always the case with these saws. But then but it's continuously moving around, so it's cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting and so on. And it's very fast. I couldn't tell you the revolutions per minute, how fast it is, but you're going to see these cut very fast. And if you go to anywhere where there's sawmill demonstrations today at a museum, that's likely what you're going to see, unless it's an old water-powered sawmill. But any steam-powered one, Hartwick Pines Logging Museum, the Pennsylvania Lumber Museum, you're going to see circular saws in use, and they're fascinating to watch. But there's a drawback with the circular saw, is that in that high speed, and it's attached in the center, and then depending on the size of your blade, you've got that radius going out, and the farther you get away from the center, that blade wobbles, and it goes back and forth wobbling, and many of the cuts could be as much as a 1/2 inch thick. Now, the blade itself is, an 1/8 of an inch, maybe that wide. So you're seeing that there's a lot of lossage of of lumber there through the kerf, the cut there in the sawdust. And a half inch doesn't seem like a lot, but if you start to add it up, and depending on how many cuts you're making on a large log, you're going to lose out on, several boards that could be cut from there. And that adds up when you're talking about thousands of logs and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of board feet of logs that are being cut. That adds up, and that's a lot of waste. But with the price of lumber and the amount that was being produced, that was considered a worthwhile loss for a long period of time. Now, this is information coming from a book that was written originally in 1951 by Robert F. Fries, Fries, called Empire in Pine. And it was about the story of lumbering in Wisconsin, 1830 to 1900. And Robert Fries has a really good concise here, is really concise about the sawmill evolution here. So what he says here, I'm taking as pretty much very good word that it's based on some good evidence from throughout Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region. But it was, like I said, that was an acceptable loss for a long period of time. But now you've got, with the railroads coming in and there's a greater demand of lumber, you need to cut faster, cut more efficient. And it's not necessarily because of that loss from that half-inch kerf that people were concerned, but how can we get more lumber to the market and make more money? That was the key. This is capitalism 101. And there's a great demand. We need to provide, our product for that demand there, the supply for it. I'm not an economist. I can't even do basic economics, huh? But anyway, so the bandsaw was invented again in England. That seems to be where all of the early technological developments happened. And it was, again, at the beginning of the 19th century. So it took a number of years for it to migrate across the Atlantic Ocean from 1808, when it was invented, to really becoming popular in the United States in the 1870s. Again, that ties in with that demand and trying to meet that demand with the supply. And it wasn't necessary prior to that when select cutting, using rivers, only cutting seasonally. But now with railroads, cutting year-round, cutting larger areas, and the greater demand with the Transcontinental Railroad, opening up new markets for lumber, the Great Plains, Nebraska, Iowa, the Dakotas, Kansas, all of that region where not a lot of forests. So you need to look for your lumber from elsewhere, and the Great Lakes was the perfect location to provide for that. So bandsaws become very much more popular. And a bandsaw is different from a circular saw, different from the up and down saws. And it is a straight saw like the up and down saws, but it's one continuous belt. And the smallest bandsaws used in sawmills for the cutting logs were generally around 20 feet long, continuous loop of a saw blade. And it's, one long 20-foot long blade that has been welded together at the ends to make this loop. And it's placed on pulleys, one up above your carriage where your log is sitting on, that's going to be bringing that log in to be cut, and then one sitting below it, so it's actually underneath the floor. So this is why you needed two-story sawmills, because a lot of your mechanisms is located underneath your saw floor. So that was where the bottom part of your pulley would be, and it's sitting on this large, or it's part of this large metal saw mechanism with a pulley up top and a pulley below, and it's being kind of separated by the floor of the mill. And in that, between it is where your carriage for your log, and it's on a track. And so it's going back and forth on that track. That would be powered or operated by the sawyer, the man in charge operating the saw. Sawyers in the forest that were pulling on saws to cut trees down, and sawyers in the sawmill were a little bit different. And here it's a high-skilled job, and it's after the foreman who was in charge of the sawmill. The sawyer was really the top man in that sawmill. And he was the one responsible for doing all the cutting. And he kept track of the speeds of what everything was operating. There were levers to disengage belt drives for the sawmill so that you could slow down or stop the operation. And then, engage that with the same hand stick there. Basically, it's a clutch. And so you're going to then engage it and get it operating. There's levers to move that carriage, moving it on and off of the track so you are getting the log on and off of the track there. And then you've got men there that are doing all the various work along with them, assisting, operating it, pulling off the boards, the tailors as they were called, that would be at the tail end of the carriage there of the kind of a pulley, or not a pulley system, but can't think of the word of the track that would rollers that the log or the boards would be rolled down to, and the men would grab those and then take it back, put them into the piles that would get, separated. So this was a lot of manpower, but there was a lot of logging that could be done. And they operated sawing could be done. And they operated these mills around the clock in some cases. You had a day shift and a night shift that were anywhere from 10 to 12 hours in length. So you could virtually cut nonstop all day, all night. They didn't do nonstop because there would be the changeover of the shifts. They would have to take blades off on a regular basis, replace a dull blade with a sharp blade, and then the dull blades would go into the filing room or filing shack, depending on the size of the sawmill. And the saw filers would then commence to sharpen those saws. Once again, all by hand, using files using to sharpen, gauges on there to make sure that the teeth are set at the correct place, because you wanted to make sure that you were cutting the most efficient way of doing it. Same thing with the crosscut saws in the logging camps, but on a much smaller usage or, doing that. So all of this was very important. And you're looking at, from thousands of board feet of lumber cut in a day to 10,000 to 100,000s of board feet cut in a day. And again, you're looking at a 24-hour operation at times. A lot of them averaged around 22 hours of doing that for operating. And there were various things that, were involved with that. And we'll get into that here in just a bit here in the episode. But so this is what you used in the evolution there, or, the kind of the peak evolution of the sawmills in the 19th century were these big giant band saws in the mills. And I say the smallest ones were around 20 feet. You had some in large mills that were upwards of 40 feet belts there. So these were huge saws. And guess what? OSHA did not exist in the 19th century. So there were hazards in the mill, dangers, there were injuries, there were fatalities. And so these could be very serious work hazards in the sawmills. And it was not a safe place to be. I'll get into in the next couple of episodes that we'll have a few weeks from now, because I'll be taking a short 2-week break here in the podcast this season. And then we'll finish with a back-to-back episodes of the labor of logging. And in that, we'll be discussing the wages, all the labor of logging, from the logging camps to the mills, to the associated jobs in there, working the river drives, working railroads. But the pay in logging camps were somewhere around $1 a day. In the mills, they were around $3 a day. Part of that was due to a higher skilled nature for much of the work, but also because of the hazards on the job. And it was tended to be a dangerous work, working in the sawmills. And so I want to give you just a couple of examples here. One example that I want to give is that of Frank Kellogg. And Frank Kellogg was an employee of the Stevens Mill in Waters, Michigan in 1898. And I want to kind of preface that this story was given to me by the late Mary Wackerly of Midland, Michigan, who I met in 2014. And she was the great-granddaughter of Frank Kellogg. And I did a presentation at the for Midland Senior Services. And after my program there, Mrs. Wackerly spoke to me and shared with me some information. And then she sent me a letter with clippings, photocopy clippings of the newspapers in Gaylord, detailing the event of Frank Kellogg's accident in the sawmill. And so this came from the Otsego County Herald in Gaylord, Michigan on July 29, 1898. Sudden death. Word came from Waters yesterday morning announcing the death of Frank Kellogg, who was employed in taking slabs from the circular saw at the Stevens Company mill. While engaged in this work, a slab went wrong, and in trying to extricate it, he was thrown against the quickly revolving saw, and his left thigh badly cut. The wound was bandaged tightly, and a doctor was sent for, but he pleaded to be taken home. He was put in a wagon bound for his home 4 miles distant at Otsego Lake Village, but on the way the bandages came loose and he bled to death before reaching his wife and children. His age was 42. The deceased leaves a widow with 7 children and brothers and sisters to mourn their loss. Mary Wackerly then provided a written account here that followed. Frank Kellogg left Julia a widow with 7 children. The youngest, Florence, was a baby. The oldest, May, was 16 years old. That was Mary Wackerly's maternal grandmother. With no help of any kind from the government, the family was destitute. The 2 oldest girls, May and Jenny, were old enough to work as live-in hired girls. Right after the funeral, the next 4 children were farmed out to various relatives. Julia couldn't bear to part with the baby, and she worked as a cook in a lumber camp near Otsego Lake. She married again in 1900 to W.S. Hayes, and only then did she get the children back. The reunited family moved from Otsego Lake to Gaylord, where they started a boarding house. So you can see that it was dangerous working in the sawmills, just as dangerous, if not more so, than in the logging camps. I want to revisit with the DeWard, where we talked about back last season of the end of the logging boom there in DeWard, and I want to go to Mabel Secord Edwards and her diary of it was the Mabel Edwards Secord diaries. I get that mixed up at times, and she was the wife of James Secord, who was the mill foreman for DeWard from 1900 to its ending in 1912. So I'm going to flip through here. Let's see if I find the right one. And okay, here it was. This would have been in 1907. March 25, or sorry, not 1907. What year? Yeah, 1907. And March 25, Jim loosened a broken toggle chain on the dump at 4:25 p.m., and the 3-pound hook flew and struck him above the right eye, through his heavy cap, knocking him down and landing 20 feet behind him. He got right up, but was very dizzy all night. He would later see the doctor, who diagnosed him with a concussion. It would bother him for several weeks, including keeping him home from work for a number of days. So you can see that not a serious injury, not one leading to death or maiming, but being concussed by, a broken piece of equipment that hit him, and that was dangerous in itself. Today, that would be, certainly taken much more seriously. We know the brain injuries, which they were not as, knowledgeable on a century plus ago. But injuries like this were quite dangerous. And, you had a lot of men, as I mentioned, working in these situations here. And I have some information, both from DeWard and then also from Grayling with the Salling Hansen Company, and talking about some of the different people working in those mills. And with some of the various information that was saved by Mabel Edwards Secord, she had copies of the DeWard Sawmill time books from her husband. And these were all donated along with her papers to the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan. And if anybody's interested in researching lumber in the Great Lakes, in particular the state of Michigan, the Bentley Library is a fantastic place to look because they hold the Michigan Historical Collections, which is the collections of the Historical Society of Michigan and its predecessor organizations, the Michigan Pioneer Society. So these have some great content in there. And so just looking at, she had the DeWard Sawmill time books from December 1901 to January 1907 and a roster of men that were employed. And it's not broken down by year in the information I have, but just overall, and it's actually by names of the men. And I did all this transcription by hand and listing all they were, and also if they had their jobs listed along in there. So we have like James E. Secord, mill foreman, Perry Anderson, edger. He quit on April 6, 1904. Andrew Erickson, longside edger, after April 6, 1904. So things like that noted in there. C.M. Church, engineer. He was the man in charge of operating the steam engine. Albert Dix, second filer. So he was working as filing the saws there, sharpening them. And what other ones? We have T.H. Glover, trimmer man. The trimmer was a secondary saw that was used for trimming off edges, basically the bark, getting them ready to go into the bandsaw. John Heron, setter, short side, so setting the saw. Alvin Eisenhath, setter, long side. Chris Larson, head sawyer on long side. Sylvester Martz, millwright. The millwright was the one who kept the mill in working order. He was kind of the master mechanic in charge of the sawmill. Andrew Matson, filer. So these were all various credited ones here. George McDonnell, head sawyer, fired on February 24th, 1902. Hiram Moore, head sawyer, after February 24th, 1902. So Hiram Moore was either probably a secondary sawyer that was promoted or was hired right in there. Maybe they had him, they weren't happy with George McDonnell, so they had Hiram Moore waiting to come in as soon as they fired McDonnell. We don't know that, but you could look at things like that. William Schoenemann, oiler. Well, that's the one thing is with steam engines, you need a lot of lubricating oil because you have all those moving parts. So an oiler is very important to work with the engineer there. So you can see, S.N. Weeks, blacksmith. All those tools, they have to be kept in good working condition. Your blacksmith did all of that work. And of course, these all became mechanics of different jobs or different types over the years. But through all of this, in this, what do we have here? December 1901 to January 1907, so roughly a 5-year span, there were 581 men who worked at the DeWard Sawmill. Not all of them worked there at the same time. These were, cumulative over that 5-year span of the men who worked there. So we don't know exactly how many worked there at one time. There were multiple shifts we know of, 2 shifts, a day shift and a night shift. And they went back and forth. Sometimes if the business was slow, the night shift was shut down. And so you had men thrown out of work. Maybe they were able to pick up other work in DeWard or head out to the woods to work in the logging camps until the need was for to bring back on that second shift again. So just like anything in industry, it fluctuated quite a bit. To go along with the DeWard Sawmill time books, I also have from the Bentley Historical Library, we have the Salling Hansen and Company time books. The Salling Hansen and Company records were some of the most complete records that were ever given to the Bentley Historical Library. Unfortunately, at the time that happened, in the 1960s, the 1970s, they didn't know what to do with such a large collection, so they got rid of some of it. That is something I don't want to get into here on this podcast because I have strong feelings about that, because this turned out to be one of my main research focuses as a forest history professional, lumber history. But anyway, so some of the information that survived were logbooks and time books. And so I have information from 3 different time books that were from the Salling Hansen Company. And we have the first one was January 1891 to April 1892. And this does not have the listing of different jobs that people did, but just the names. And then, so they knew who it was, who to get paid by. And I don't have in this the information on like what they were getting paid. At the time that I transcribed this, I was mostly interested in the names of the people because I was focusing in on the Salling Hansen Company in the 1890s for work that we did in interpretation at Hartwick Pines Logging Museum. But in the January 1891 to April 1892, so not quite a year and a half, in their time books, they had 412 different men employed in that mill or in the mills. And I say mills because the Salling Hansen Company had multiple mills in operation in Grayling during this time period of the 1890s, kind of the height of logging they had in this locale, though they also had a deep cut in the recession of the Panic of 1893. But during the period prior to this, they had the band mill, which was the main bandsaw in operation. They had a circular sawmill. And then they also had at least 3 smaller mills, a lath mill, a shingle mill, and a sash mill. So they were cutting, a planing mill, not sash mill. I don't know where I came from with that. But so the planing mill would have been finishing of anything coming out of the bandsaw wasn't quite ready. They had to plane it or sand them to smooth the boards ready for sale, retail. Not everything went into that right away. Some of them, planing mills, they were shipped to planing mills elsewhere, Chicago, Detroit, or to whoever they're purchasing of the lumber might finish it off that way. And then lath mill and shingle mills would have been used for smaller items. Lath is, for plastering, the small thin boards that were put in the walls to attach the plaster to, and then wood shingles, of course, for the house. So not all of these mills would have always been in operation at the same time. So you're looking at the bulk of the men working would have been in the bandsaw mill, the band mill there, along with quite a few in the circular sawmill too. And the circular sawmill continued to be used even after the bandsaw became popular. It could be used for secondary usages. Some did early cuts, and then the bandsaw would complete it on larger logs going through. But you had all of these mills in use. And in a town like Grayling, to piggyback off of the railroad logging, those sawmills would not have existed until the railroad made it up through the central part of the northern part of the lower peninsula, away from the mouths of the rivers. And because here you had the logs being moved in by railroad to those sawmills, and then the finished lumber being shipped out by rail to markets. Most of it, for the most part, coming from Grayling, were going to Detroit and Chicago. But they were going, sometimes bypassing those transportation centers and going directly on the large rail lines, the Michigan Central Railroad that connected into to Chicago, to the Transcontinental Railroad. And they, yes, they still went to Chicago, but they didn't, end up in a Chicago lumber yard, but just transferred from one rail line to a second one, and then going further west on the Union Pacific Railroad out to the Great Plains, or from Detroit going on to the New York Central Railroad, going back east to New York City, to Albany, to places there, and to be used either there in the east, or to go on to ships to be going across to the Atlantic Ocean, because the Sailing Hansen Company did have customers in Europe. Many lumber companies in the United States did with that. But so the sawmills here, the evolution of them were very important to continue the prosperity of the lumber industry. And yes, I say the prosperity, we're talking the economic prosperity today. Just a few weeks ago, we talked about with the economic or the environmental impact and how that led to wildfires, that led to localized climate change, not necessarily permanent climate change at that time. But so we know the environmental impact of logging, but it was also very important with the economic impact. And yes, it was dangerous work. And I just used briefly the story of Frank Kellogg in Waters, Michigan, and with James Secord's head injury, concussion in DeWard. We'll get more into the hazards of that when we do the labor of logging. And that will be coming up, not next week, not the week after, but it'll be 3 weeks from now. I'm going to be taking the next 2 weeks off on the podcast. Initially, as I mentioned with the last episode, I had lined up two great guests, Kyle Bagnall of the Mackinac Historic Sites, and he was going to talk about the passenger pigeon. And then also Bruce Lynn of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, and talk about lumber, lakes, and lighthouses, and in particular about a couple of shipwrecks of lumber schooners in the Great Lakes. Well, we're going to still do that, but I could not schedule them in time because coming up here is going to be my podcast tour that I've mentioned that I'm going to be going on July 31 to August 16. And so during that time period, since I wasn't able to schedule Kyle and Bruce in time, we're going to postpone that to, I'm going to interview them in September, and we'll do some special episodes in either September, October, of where we will hear, a little bit more of the lumber industry, of the forest history, because Kyle's is not really lumber involved at all, but the forest history with the extinction of the passenger pigeon. But so labor of logging is going to be August 18th and August 25th. So that will take us right up to the end of August and just before Labor Day. And we'll talk about the men, the women, and the children who worked in logging, either directly in there in the camps or in the mills, on the river drives, on the railroads, or in jobs that were associated with logging in the mill towns and work like that. So we'll stay tuned for that one, for those episodes. Take a couple of weeks break, catch up on episodes if you haven't heard them all, and you can follow me on Facebook at Rob Berg Envirohistorian. That's the public Facebook page that I have, and I will be popping in with updates on the tour, on some of the places that I'm visiting, and some little tidbits on forest history of the northern lower peninsula, the upper peninsula, northern Wisconsin, and eastern and northeastern Minnesota. So you'll want to stay tuned and follow along on that. So just as always, if you enjoy the podcast, please tell a friend. Word of mouth is the best way for the growth of the podcast, and all of you are helpful with that. And also, if you really enjoy it, think about becoming a supporter. Go to the webpage, and you'll see the web address in the episode notes on your podcast provider. And go there, and you'll see on to click on support, and you can give as little as $3 a month up to $10 a month. If you want to do something more, then you can contact me directly and we can work something out. But this goes to continue to keep the podcast on the air, helps to pay for my subscription to my podcast host, also for the licensing fees for the music on here, that cool intro and outro music that I have here, and also to help pay for any type of equipment upgrades, technology, and pay for things help pay for things like the podcast tour that keeps me on the road, literally, because, gas money is always necessary. So thanks again for listening in, and hope that you'll be listening again soon. Thanks. Goodbye. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg Environmental Historian.